I think a somewhat unique characterization of the enslavement of Africans is it's racially justified and racially motivated.
Of
Uh,
course, and they use the Bible as a justification, I believe.
over time, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for showing up to this overdue uh, completion of something we started in February, or
Very
rather,
long
the beginning of
overdue
end of
episode.
January. Um, don't I think I'm about to give up on the concept of scheduling altogether. Anyway,
Yeah, it's hard to do. It's hard to manage when one of us is working and then, things happen too regarding your health. So
yeah.
it's a hard thing to manage.
Well,
We
actually,
left
as
off,
of this, we will be caught up on everything that we scheduled to do in January. So that's exciting.
yeah, and we keep our expectations low, and the more people we get, if we get 3 people this month, we'll be happy. So 3 new people. Um, so we left off at the Cambodian genocide, and I can't remember
You were sneezing and
where.
you were sneezing your brains out, so we didn't get
Yeah,
anything
that was
done.
the day that my nose became a faucet, right?
Yes. So,
Yeah,
might as well start from beginning.
yeah, we definitely should. So the Cambodian case, um, I should start out by saying that um, the Cambodian genocide or the Khmer Rouge terror was one of the, as far as the percentage in which it affected a population, was one of the worst events of the 20th century, which is saying a lot, as we know, because the 20th century is by far the most bloody century in human existence that we know of.
Industrializing killing sure does make it faster, doesn't it?
It does. And for the Cambodian genocide to stand out really says something about the regime of the Khmer Rouge, and the sort of, how should I put it? Um, I'd almost call it like a very, very literal interpretation of Maoism, or the very, very worst aspects of Marxism. Um, a lot of people tend to call it sort of a democide, which means like,
As in demos, as in people.
yeah,
Okay.
because it's sort of, when we're talking about genocide, the ironic thing about it is that the vast majority of victims in the Cambodian genocide do not fall under that category. The vast majority of victims comprise the Khmer ethnic group, which are the Cambodian ethnic group, and they are the majority ethnic group. Yet the regime itself was a Khmer nationalist ethnic group. They followed this sort of Marxist nationalism, national liberation. Actually, I don't know if I'd put national liberation, because that tends to be a little bit more towards like a liberal end of the spectrum. They were a Khmer ultra nationalist group with sort of a orthodox Marxist ideology. And their idea was to create civilization from the ground up. And we must talk a little bit about, how they started. I think that would be probably more suited for a whole episode, because really we could dedicate a whole episode on the Khmer Rouge, the Vietnam War, and what led to them. They were predominantly a peasant movement that emerged with sort of the poor agricultural population, which I think was the majority of the Cambodian population at the time. And their terror was directed against ethnic minorities, the urban class particularly, and even the sort of middle class as well. So the vast majority of victims do not, are not victims of genocide in this case, and that's kind of one of the major issues with it. A genocide verdict was reached with the destruction of the Cambodian ethnic Vietnamese community, which the Khmer Rouge were rabidly anti-Vietnamese. They viewed, it goes back several centuries, the antagonism between these two ethnic groups. They also committed the largest crime against an ethnic Chinese population outside of China. So in Southeast Asia, the merchant class or middle class role is usually filled in by the ethnic Chinese population, and they were targeted. The genocide ruling did not apply to them, actually. They were targeted mainly for their class background, not necessarily their ethnic background. And then the other group where they reached a genocide verdict is the Cham ethnic group, which are a Muslim ethnic group in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia. They used to have their own state, actually, an empire called Champa, like a Muslim Cham empire. And that the Khmer Rouge harkened back to all of sort of their ancient past. A lot of genocidal regimes, as you know, they do this. They come up with this sort of glorious past. And what they were trying to do was sort of recreate this utopian Angkor Wat Khmer civilization. And by doing that, they would rid society of the parasites, microbes. They actually use the term microbes a lot in describing the urban population and these ethnic minority groups. So their language is very genocidal,
If
for
I
sure.
recall correctly, this is the late 60s, 68, 69, right?
No, so it happens
the
around
Khmer Rouge,
75. It's
the Khmer
after,
Rouge starts taking power then, as an
well, the movement
yes,
gains power during 68, particularly 69, when the Vietnam War, when Nixon expands the war into the into Cambodia.
yeah,
So
Vietnam
when there was an invasion,
plays
of
a fairly
Cambodia.
significant portion into how this comes about.
It does. It does, because the North Vietnamese army were using Cambodia to supply their forces, their guerrilla forces in South Vietnam. And the American Air Force and American Navy in particular conducted, I think even to this day, it's not really fully appreciated the extent of the bombing campaigns in Southeast Asia during, from 64 to, I don't know, 75, 74, 73. What strengthened the Khmer Rouge movement was this increase in bombing. Many villages were devastated, families were destroyed, and the rural population became susceptible to this extremist ideology. And when I study a lot of these extremist groups, whether they be the Nazis, the Stalinist forces like Komsomol, all of the various communist youth organizations. And by far, to me, the Khmer Rouge is the most ideologically terrifying to me in a lot of ways, because you essentially, they were able to sort of brainwash children to kill others.
So,
and not just kill them by denouncing them, like in the Soviet case, where you have children in classes who spy or report on their parents. You have predominantly, in large part, a children army with the Khmer Rouge. I mean, not all of the fighters are children, but a lot of them are. And they're the ones who are sort of enforcing this collectivization in the countryside.
So there's an interesting bit of language and a concept that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge kind of get into in 75. This erasure of history and this starting over, which they call year zero.
Year zero.
Um,
Yeah.
and that ties into this this genocidal language and this glorification of a mystical past type situation that I think is really indicative of how they justified what was happening, because this
Of
erasure
course.
and starting over of history coincides with the start of these killings.
Hmm. The killing too is a part of transforming society and a part of you know, they sort of implement, communism right away. They implement this within the villages, and what's astounding is they completely depopulate urban centers for about 5 years, I think, is how long they were there until the North Vietnamese basically took them out of power, out of central power. They fought on as a guerrilla force for a long time, though. I think up until the early 90s, actually, Vietnam was fighting the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So, I mean, they weren't completely defeated or, you know, up until the 90s.
But their ability to kill people was severely curtailed.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They essentially became, you know, they were basically pushed out of power and then became a guerrilla force. And a lot of the reason why they were fighting as guerrilla forces, I think, had to do with the fact that many of them were guilty of horrible crimes. And of course, they were going to face some sort of punishment for it. So that was their motivation in continuing fighting. I can't, you can't quote me on this, but this is what I do understand, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of language too in regards to, I don't know if you've heard, I think it was Lenin who said, those who do not work will not eat. Like most totalitarian communist regimes, they take this to an extreme. And I think it was a term Pol Pot said that, I got to look this up, actually. It's very interesting.
That's why we have Google at the same time.
Hmm.
Let's see, what do I got?
Let's see. The interesting thing too, so I'll find that quote at some other time. I don't want to take away because we got a lot to cover. But the interesting thing too about the Khmer Rouge is, unlike a lot of other, totalitarian Stalinist style regimes, you don't have a cult of personality around Pol Pot at all. You have the cult of personality of Angkor, of the party itself. And that's something that's very unique, actually, I think, in the history of tyranny and totalitarian regimes. You don't have a central cult of personality.
It's dispersed throughout the concept of the state in and of itself.
Yeah.
Didn't
And
they
very
keep
much to this reaching of an ideal.
Pol Pot
There are a
under
lot of
house arrest?
parallels. What'd you say?
Didn't they keep Pol Pot under house arrest for quite some time?
Yeah, I believe that's
Until he died, I
that is,
think.
yeah, how he died. He died under house arrest. Um, the people that have gone through this, the people survivors that I've met, I've had the opportunity to meet a few survivors, and it's basically like a nation killing itself. it's almost, it goes beyond even like a civil war, like what you see in, like in Syria, where, there's just massive fighting. I mean, it's an auto, a lot of people have referred to it as sort of, they've come up with this term, which some people dispute, called auto genocide, which means the titular group in power killing itself. To be fair, the Khmer Rouge were not killing other Khmers because they were Khmers. They were killing them because they did not meet the ideals that they had placed for themselves and for this new utopian society. And even some of the Khmer people that lived in the border regions of Vietnam, they would refer to them, these are Khmer people who have Vietnamese minds. Because the people in these border regions, like people in many border regions, they speak, they might even be more fluent, for example, in Vietnamese, or more acculturated into Vietnamese than they are into the Cambodian culture. So particularly these groups, this is where you have actually the Khmer Rouge targeting the poorer people, is, of their own ethnic group, with these people who live in the border regions. Intellectuals were completely targeted, to the point where anyone who wore glasses was considered suspect and usually killed.
Uh-oh.
They had a facility in Phnom Penh, the capital city. I think it's called, what is it? It's a museum now, but around like 20,000 people went through it, and the majority of people who were interned in it did not make it out. What do you? S21, I think.
Hang on.
Yeah, S21.
Well, I think there is a aspect to that particular ideal of trying to find this pure, idealized individual to partake in the society. That's like it comes from, I think, the kind of attitude that you see in totalitarian regimes in the first place. Is there's this shrinking of power to an acceptable group, and that acceptable group is forever becoming smaller and smaller as uh, they gain more power and more refinement.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and
That's a good point.
it's not even necessarily only limited to totalitarianism, in that you'll see this kind of attitude in the nativist movement in the United States, which was not necessarily always in power in most places, but that they have an exclusion of who is included in the protected status of white can change dramatically over time.
Of course, it changes over time, but originally it's the sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group
Right.
that is ideal.
But it
They
excludes.
looked down upon. Go ahead.
But for example, it would explicitly exclude people like Catholics, many of
Of
whom
course.
would otherwise today be considered part of the white race. Um, it excludes them. And the point that I try to make to people all the time is, just because you are not opposed to people who are being targeted now does not mean that some characteristic of yours won't be used to include you in that group later.
That's true. These things are fluid, they evolve. I want to state too that, like you said, that this feature of the Khmer Rouge, it existed in other totalitarian regimes. I can't say that they were unique. The Nazis very much were trying to cleanse their own racial body of these, of undesirables. The Soviets were trying to create a new Soviet Homo Sovieticus, sort of this new person who fit their ideals. And the same is true also for Mao's China. But yeah, the Khmer Rouge took this to a very extreme level, to a level that was much, much more extreme, at least in this regard, than the Nazis were.
Yeah, I
And there are
think.
many parallels between them.
Well, I think that's like there's a certain merging of concepts that you see here, like the Rwandan genocide uh, is an internal, for the lack of, or even Sudan prior to the separation of it into two countries. You can see it as a
Yeah.
civil war. Uh, I don't necessarily think that something being a civil war doesn't preclude, at the very least, ethnic cleansing from happening.
Civil wars are where it occurs the most, actually. I
Right,
would say it's almost your sort of textbook like condition for ethnic cleansing. A lot of civil wars are driven, are ethnically driven. They are ethnically or religiously driven. Um, there are some, in the case of the Spanish Civil War, for example, where it is completely political. There is sort of a sub ethnic component with that in regards to like Barcelona, Catalonia, in that area, which had sort of a distinct culture. Um, but by and large, the Spanish Civil War is a political fight.
right.
Um,
I
the
think that
same thing with the American Civil War as well, although there's of course the component of slavery as a cause of it, but it's just one cause of it, a major cause, but
well,
still
it's funny
one.
you should mention that because that's
Yeah.
incidentally the essay I'm working on, and that's a much more complicated question. Like there is the Confederacy um, advanced a anti-Mexican policy principally because Mexico was a haven for runaway slaves, and they advanced an
Hmm.
anti-Cuban policy. Like we want to invade Cuba, slow down. You couldn't get into Pennsylvania there, Johnny Reb, but
Hmm.
we want to invade Cuba and take it over for slavery. And there is a very ethnic component because of how racial I think a somewhat unique characterization of the enslavement of Africans is it's racially justified and racially motivated.
Of
Uh,
course, and they use the Bible as a justification, I believe.
Over time, yes.
Yeah.
So and navigating that particular essay is what I've been working on right now, and it's turning into a much larger task than I initially anticipated. But that's beside the
It's
point.
a very, very complicated topic. Um, it's something too, I think that, now there's, especially in recent years, with the removal of various Confederate monuments and things like this, it sort of brought this discussion back to center stage about the primacy of slavery as a cause in of the American Civil War. Um, I don't know where my position lies on that. I think it's a I think that the causes, there's a multitude of causes, but certainly that is a major one, if
Well,
not one of the largest ones.
so the answer is, I think, a little more complicated insofar as the cause of what actually makes the war happen uh,
Mhm.
is the balance of power between free states and slave states.
Yeah,
Because Lincoln is elected.
and civil wars are always about a balance of power,
Yes, but Lincoln is
whether it
elected,
is in regard. Yeah,
and it's a three-way race, right?
yeah.
So the border states, the border slave states that uh, don't vote for Lincoln are don't secede, but the states that there's 11 states that vote for a third candidate, and all of them immediately secede when their candidate loses. So there is this question of balance of power, but the balance of power is not about the people try to talk about how the war was about slavery or states' rights or whatnot. It was this amalgamation of slavery as it represents a state's power.
Yeah.
So that
This
because
actually, Hmm.
So you have this intersection of commerce and the way America was funded them as tariffs, and you have this intersection of power and voting and the nature of the Constitution, uh, and all of that to create to create this investment in this system, not only as a means of security for the planter class in the South, but as a means of political security for those states as a whole. And that's what causes the
For
war,
both
and not
states, yeah.
necessarily something as simple as enslavement.
Of course, yeah. Of course, it's a combination of these factors acting in tandem. Actually, us going into this conversation, it's interesting because it's good because we planned on discussing um, the indigenous people of the United States and Canada, as well as the slave trade as examples of genocide. Um, Civil wars are usually noted by their ferocity and their brutality. In regard to the American Civil War, as far as I know, I think for one, depictions of it, like a lot of film depictions, literary depictions, don't necessarily portray it as savage and bloody as it was. Um, with the exception, for example, of Kansas and Missouri, where did the largest I mean in of course, like, I guess we could talk about the Sherman's March and sort of scorched earth campaign in the South, but where did this conflict get truly violent, like a civil war that we know today, where it's taking the lives of civilians and sort of innocent people? As far as I know, it's primarily in the case in Missouri and Kansas, right?
Kansas, are you referring to Kansas prior to the Civil War and Bleeding Kansas? And
No, no, during. Have you ever heard of the Lawrence Massacre?
yes, but I'm just trying to. Here's the kind of.
The Jayhawkers and the Bushwhackers?
Yes, that was
Yeah,
a particular case, but the thing to kind of quantify here is that the Civil War is at a technologically awkward time in military history. Um, you're right in between the industrialization of combat power that happens after the Civil War, and you're
hmm
right bef- and you're just coming basically out of a very Napoleonic concept, like the concepts developed out of
of
the
warfare,
Napoleonic
linear
Wars,
warfare, yeah.
of linear, like if you kind of say Clausewitz or uh, Jomini is the epitome of the understanding of liminal or linear warfare, then you're kind of right at this height. So you have a technology that's starting to outpace liminal warfare, um, and you have a technology that's starting to outpace it. So you have rifles that are much more accurate, that render lines much more dangerous to stand in than they were before. You have artillery that's
hmm
much longer ranged and more capable of hitting targets with ease. And you have this concept of war that's 50 years behind, uh, that's focused on very much because it's focused on Germany tactics and not strategy.
Yeah.
Um, so you get these high casualty counts overall because you're having very bloody and somewhat strategically unnecessary fights like Antietam
Yeah.
or Chancellorsville or Gettysburg, um, that don't serve an overall strategic purpose, uh, unless you're the Union and you just need to beat up Confederates. So the degree to which civilians are involved, though, and the degree to which people are massacred or black Union soldiers are massacred or increases because you have uh, a lot of things like cavalry raids, where cavalry is not nearly as used in the same way it was before. So now it's being used as a scouting force and this somewhat mobile infantry force, like a dragoon, as opposed
hmm
to uh, you had like at Waterloo, you had charges of French and British cavalry, for example, where they tried to charge each other's
hmm
lines. You don't see that happening. You're seeing cavalry being used in other ways, so they're attacking civilian targets. all across the north and south on both sides. They're attacking civilian infrastructure like railroads. So there's more
Mhm.
casualties in that way than there would have been before, because you're starting to see the battle space is no longer confined to a field. It's starting to become more diverse and spread out. And this kind of starts this, and then you see this really, uh, the most famous example being Sherman's march to Atlanta and the burning of Atlanta.
Mhm.
So you see all of those things sort of presage the kind of total war that you see practiced in World War II, and to a
Mhm.
lesser extent in World War One. But I don't know how much of the fact that World War One is less directly destructive to civilians that comes down to the
Wait.
fact that the fronts
Mhm.
didn't move much. So, like, you have the
Mhm.
blockade of Germany by the United Kingdom, and that causes hunger and famine and death. But you don't have, and you have in the border areas like in Belgium and Holland, you have massacres of
Mhm.
civilians by the German troops. Um, I don't know if the war was more mobile, there might have been more
In the
widespread
east,
direct
you
civilian
have
death.
more in the east. Um, in the Eastern Front of World War One, that's where you have a lot of instances of violence against civilians. It's primarily directed um, by, I would say that Russian forces and Austrian forces have the lion's share of it, but yeah, there's a lot of instances in that case, and then with the continuation sort of this war with the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, you have, I mean, it's one of the first, I think, major conflicts of the 20th century where you have a
Mass
lot of
civilian
civilian
attacks,
massacres.
yes.
Yeah,
The
particularly of the Jewish population, in both regards, actually, in regards to Russia's advances in Austro-Hungarian Galicia in Ukrainian. You have them committing pogroms and robbery, slaughter, things like this. Um, and then the same thing happens, of course, during the Civil War.
there's a hell of a lot more
But
movement on the Eastern Front in World War One too, though.
yeah,
Uh,
and that has to do, I think, with the fact of movement.
like there's
But in
more
regard,
retreating and falling
go
back
ahead.
and advancing. And the other thing to keep in mind is not a lot of people think about this, but there's a lot of fighting and civilian deaths all up and down the Ottoman Empire, and especially as you start getting more south in the area around Palestine, you start to see a whole lot more civilian deaths as well. And
And then also north near the Russian border too.
the mobilization of the civilian population to fight the Ottomans. Uh, T.E. Lawrence, pretty famous example of that. You kind of see this, not partisan. We're having an argument about the word partisan right now. However, you start to see this kind of guerrilla movement grow up, a very early
Mhm.
version of it in World War One. Um, a government-backed guerrilla campaign, sophisticated from the United Kingdom into the Ottoman Empire. So you see a whole lot more avenues as technology and capabilities grow to
Mhm.
cause a lot more damage and destruction.
I was just going to mention too that in regards to the Ottoman case, the Armenians
That
were
too,
sort of
yes.
they were victims. One of the major reasons why they were targeted was because they had there was a population of them within the Russian Empire, and then also one within the Ottoman Empire, the bigger one within the Ottoman Empire. And they were also fighting in the Caucasus and with Tsarist forces. So the Armenians were,
They got hit twice.
yeah.
Uh,
I don't think Russian forces actually, as far as I know, in World War One targeted Armenians at all. In fact, I think the opposite. They protected them. Um, Mainly because they're a Christian group. They're seen as Orthodox Christians, even though their version of Christianity is older.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, so in this case, in these areas with movement, then you even have genocide in
Well,
regards, in the South.
Well, yeah, in reference to Armenia, I've heard it said that Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. Um, so I always found that to be a very interesting connection and probably a very motivating factor for the Ottomans to, as a religious one, to
Mhm.
commit a genocide against Armenia. Of course, the current Turkish regime is not particularly friendly either, especially if you're Kurdish.
No, they're not. And I think, the 2020 war, there's something in really bad taste of them sending military advisors to assist Azerbaijan against Armenia. There's
Yeah.
something in real bad taste with that. But that's a whole different topic. Something that we should talk about at some point. Um, in regards, so to go forward, um, let's see.
We have gotten a little off topic. Let's get back here. Cambodia.
We talked
We
at length
we talked
about
about Bosnia.
Bosnia. Yeah, I think that we should talk about perhaps, the argument in regards to the indigenous populations of the United States and Canada. And then we can, of course, bring up the issue of the boarding schools and the eraser of culture, with Article 2A. So here's the thing. Um, it's almost impossible to argue that Native Americans are not a post-genocidal society because they certainly are. Um,
I have a couple questions actually to refine this. Uh,
yeah,
we have we have a very interesting set of intersections happening in some parts of
yeah,
this too. The first thing is to acknowledge that this is almost a scale that defies anything else in history. You have what essentially amounts to a 400-year campaign to depopulate areas of land, um, and every dirty trick in the book is pulled out to do this. But
of course.
there is there's an intersection, for example, between escaped enslaved individuals and the Creek people. When you had the Seminole Wars, you see these kind of or even the first set of enslaved individuals brought to America escaped and went to live with Native Americans. The There's a lot of connection between the racism that animates the enslavement of Africans and the racism that animates the attempts to take uh, Native American land. Um,
Hmm.
and you see this very long and sustained campaign. But at the same time, on this, you see a very ardent resistance throughout much of that period of time by these native groups. And at this point, they're becoming very commingled with escaped enslaved populations. That they resist and they fight back in many cases. You have very bloody campaigns waged, especially early in the colonial history, um, that aren't really talked about a lot, um, but are very, I think, formative to discuss. I know the YouTube channel Attaché, which covers a lot of Civil War history, covers Prince Philip War a lot, and that was a fairly sustained.
Prince Philip War is the one, isn't it sometimes referred to as the French Indian War?
No, King
Or is this
Philip's War. I'm sorry. The French and Indian War is the 7 Years' War,
okay, yeah.
which was once referred to as the First World War. And I had another argument with someone about that recently, too. But at any rate, you have these conflicts. So my question becomes, uh, arguably, what you have with the Native Americans in both the United States and Canada is something akin to a super genocide, a very long, sustained period of time. But the fact that there is such fierce resistance over that period of time, does that affect the verdict in this particular case of whether or not it's a
It's
genocide?
very hard to retroactively look at this topic that way. It's very difficult because it's a very long, prolonged period. It involves multiple colonial actors, some of which pursued different policies policies that are absolutely different. I would argue that all of them had, aspects, that, in their policies that were very close to this definition, but also, this is long before we had a lot of these legal concepts. I am sure, and I know for a fact they do exist with certain people in power at various times, people utilizing language saying that, okay, we have to wipe this group of people out as we colonize the land. We have to push them away. They were doomed to die. So there is language like that. At the same time, though, finding like an actual policy where this is pursued, and to the degree, at least in regards to like extermination, either in whole or in part, that's where it gets really tricky.
There is, I think, so you obviously have those cases of death and executions and massacres that pop up throughout
Yeah.
reading about Native American interactions with, and or more accurately, the colonial interactions with Native Americans.
Mhm.
You see those pop up, but I think there's also this overwhelming attitude of like Christianization and civilizing,
Naming
quote
them,
unquote,
yeah, and getting rid of,
and
supplanting and subsuming their culture, of course.
and this it's this cultural erasure and this shrinking
Yeah.
of this culture, and that feels like it can be the most effective bridge for this problem in my mind.
You also have examples throughout this period of population movement, transfer of children to others. So you do have that.
Yes,
And I think
there's this taking away of children.
Raphael Lemkin, when he was coming up with the concept, when he was, thinking and contemplating this legal concept of genocide, I'm sure he had thought about colonial empires, and in particular the North and South American, Central American cases, for sure. I'm sure that this was in his mind, because you see that, you see examples on the 1948 convention that are certainly meet the criteria. The issue is, though, is like, in terms of exterminating the whole people, it's just, it's one of those things where the results sort of speak for themselves in a way, but also you don't have a whole lot you don't have a whole lot in terms of like, the policies change, they evolve over time.
Right.
And exterminating a group of people physically takes an enormous effort.
Well,
And it's done usually, I mean, the most clear-cut examples of genocide are that of person-to-person extermination and physical violence involved in it. The areas where it gets murky is, where it's a certain policy that resulted in it. For example, where like, okay, so they don't have food.
like the Holodomor, yes.
Voldemort to some degree, yeah, I would say.
I think though this kind of brings up the point that we kind of got at the first time around, that the convention is not necessarily fit for purpose anymore.
It's not, and because of because of this case in particular, in the case of the slave trade, and also in the case of the Holodomor in Ukraine, and also Stalin's political purges and ethnic cleansings, his moving of ethnic groups from one area to another. When the Soviet Union and the United States objected to a lot.
Yes.
And we get this kind of diluted law, this sort of diluted legal device
which
that's not really intended the way that I think Lemkin wanted it.
yeah,
In fact, we know it is.
I also think there's another particular problem that arises uh, in that we don't have a system fit for purpose. We also don't have a system to enforce that system, even if we did have a legal definition that was fit for purpose. And you have
Yeah,
this effect.
there's no, yeah. To this day, it hasn't been, there's debate on intervention over this and, how to intervene. And there is certain scholars, I think Leo Cooperman's a big one, who's anti-interventionalist, who argues that intervention can make the situation worse. I read a few of his articles. He was against, for example, he wrote about, after the Rwandan genocide occurred, there was a big debate over intervention. And he was one of the ones who argued against it. He was on the side against it. And he also is very critical of the term genocide. He actually would rather the term like be used as mass violence in general, mass violence. But yeah, in regard to the Rwandan genocide, hindsight is 2020. But I think an intervention, a very small one, could have made a big difference. It could
Well,
have stopped it.
the convention outlines this particular set of circumstances under which genocide is occurring. And it
Yeah,
outlines a physical set of circumstances and a kind of cultural set of circumstances, like this
it does. Yeah,
erasure of culture. Um, I think that the problem that you run into uh, is we focus very much on the physical aspects of this a lot, but the
yeah, we do.
cultural aspects can be so much more damaging. Um,
In the case of the native indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the northern Western Hemisphere, this damage is catastrophic. I mean, look at the percentage of people. So take the Navajo, for example, one of the larger um, surviving Native American groups. How many of them know the language?
it's a the language I think is very much in trouble. Uh,
Yeah, most of them are. I say. Whereas, in certain cases in Central America or South America, a lot of those languages are flourishing. You can find, for example, communities in, I wouldn't say flourishing. I don't want to dismiss the impact of you know, state violence in those regions because it's horrible. I mean, in regards to
right.
the Guatemalan case, it's horrible. And we can go on through other South American countries as well. Paraguay is one. But in this case, you do have populations which are speaking these languages and actually don't even, some of them, depending on how remote they live, they don't speak the language of the state. They don't speak Spanish, for example, or Portuguese in the case of Brazil. Um, in regard to Canadian or American indigenous populations, that is not the case. And a lot of them too, they're um I mean, this happens to people just in general as human beings move. And it happened certainly in the South American case too, but a lot of what I was going to bring up is a lot of them they're certainly mixed with, the colonial power and as far as, their ethnicity, their
Right.
genetics. But that's not always a genocidal policy that happens just as human beings move. Um,
Right.
so
I think
yeah,
there
but
should be a distinction between forced movement of people, though that often creates genocidal conditions. Um,
I agree, and I
and
think that that should be a part of the, if there's ever amendments to the 1948 convention, that should be one.
but
I think
it
that
also
those,
creates a huge problem after the fact, I think, too.
of
So,
course,
without sticking face too far in the fire. Israel and the settlements and are a huge issue. Uh,
Yeah.
they're displacing families, but there's moving those people out would cause the issue in reverse. So you have a case where you have unsqueezed a tube of toothpaste and rectifying it once you take it. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Rectifying it at that point becomes dangerous. It has to be navigated very carefully. I think a lot of work has to be done to understand how to do that.
Regarding the Israeli settlements within the, yeah, what you bring up there in regards to the West
And
Bank
that's just
and
one
Israel
example.
too, it's not just getting, not just removing these settlements, it's also the infrastructure that was built there. And some of these settlements, which are technically illegal by international law, they're fully functioning towns. They have all of the infrastructure, Israeli infrastructure, which is very good. And there is the example of Gaza, which did create a lot of problems for the Israelis in terms of when they actually pulled out, they forced the settlers out of Gaza.
Yeah.
That was a big issue, but they were able to do that. So, I mean, they can do this if they choose,
I don't
but
think
it
it's
creates a big problem. It's politically a big problem because the majority of settlers, probably over 50% of them, maybe more, are the Orthodox population who view settling these lands, which biblically, the most significant lands for the Jewish people are actually within, Palestinian territory as far as like their significance. A lot of Israel, the territory around the coast was not as associated with the two kingdoms, and with, the Jewish past. But you're going back to a very far past there, and also, the modern Israeli population, which the Israeli population is hugely cosmopolitan. It's essentially, and this is not even counting, there's a huge, within Israel itself, there's a huge Israeli Arab population, which are fully functioning members of society. There's, issues over certain rights that they have. But as a lot of them are in better straits there than they are, for example, in some other country. But the main thing too is that your modern population, Israeli population, it's not the same Israel. It's not the same, you know, Israelites.
no, there is very much a
Bible.
degree to which Israel is
Yeah.
heavily dominated by a hyper ultra nationalist conservative faction. Uh, that
Yeah. And for a long time, Israel, not so much anymore, but for a long time, it was dominated by the Ashkenazi ethnic group, so the European Jewish ethnic group. And these were the ones who were the most prominent in the Zionist movement. Actually, some of the founders of both, the left wing and right wing Zionist groups were actually they were actually people from Ukraine, believe it or not. They were Jews from Ukraine.
right,
It's interesting. I was reading an article by Israel Bartel. He's a Slavicist in, I think he's in Hebrew University in I don't know if that's in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. But he does a lot, in regards to Yiddish literature, to, Hebrew literature, and in terms of the intersection with Slavic culture. And he wrote a really interesting article. So, Cossacks, the Ukrainian sort of like cowboy, group, or the
right.
Russian, like warrior culture, the Ukrainian warrior culture. I don't know if you know their significance to Jews. There's sort of like to
It,
some, like because of the massacres which occurred, particularly in the 17th century and 18th centuries in Ukraine, there's a negative connotation. But for a group of these Zionists who were from the left bank of Ukraine, uh, Poltava, for example, Chernihiv region, where I spent a lot of time, when they were going to Palestine, adopted this sort of idea is that we're this frontier warrior people going back to our lands and protecting it. We will have to turn ourselves into Cossacks. And it's very interesting how these groups, and they almost fought like that in terms of how, they develop these self-defense groups, cavalry groups. It's very, very similar, but it's interesting that they would turn to that.
Well, so
That the Israel-Palestinian conflict is something that needs to be discussed in regards, to genocide and all of that other thing. There is, in 1948, there's certainly ethnic cleansing that occurs, a very massive one. Palestinians call it al-Nakba. I think it's like the catastrophe. It's the removal from their lands.
right.
Most scholarly estimates of the civilian deaths on their side are somewhere like 10,000, which is fairly high. It's a whole can of worms to discuss it, but yeah, it's something. It is something that needs to be discussed, because a lot of these people who, and I'm not bashing, I'm not trying to pick one side or the other, but I'm just saying the facts. So a lot of the people, especially the people like Volodymyr Jabotinsky, who's the founder of, I think, the revisionist Zionism, the right wing, Zionism, he has certainly proto-fascist views influenced by European fascism. He's a very interesting character, very complicated one. But you have these views, these traditional European colonialist views coming into these people's mindset, because that's the milieu of the time.
Well, I think, because I spoke earlier about the tendencies of totalitarian regimes, and there's subset of totalitarian regime being fascism and et cetera, et cetera. You will get a position where even people who do not necessarily uh, are not necessarily totalitarian are going to look to the past as a form of validity. So you find something in the past to hold on to uh, make your position feel more valid.
And in regards to yeah, go ahead.
And whether or not that thing is true in a general sense can be very dependent on the case. Like Christopher Columbus is, I think, a pretty pertinent example for most Americans, where you have this situation where Christopher Columbus was despised in his time, and he is the person who was such an outrageous asshole that all of Europe decided maybe we should come up with some human rights laws. But you have him presented in the America because his story was at a time advantageous to spin a certain way for Italian American immigrants. You have him presented as a hero who discovers a continent.
Yeah.
There is a very strong desire, especially amongst conservatives, to create validation from arguing that this is how it was and this is how it should be. And this in turn creates a position amongst their opponents that say, is it? And they start asking those questions. But the net effect of all of this, and you see this across societies, the net effect of all of this is that we don't necessarily talk about things in terms of what we should do. We talk about them and how we have done it. And we aren't always able to move beyond this traditionalist concept. And in a lot of ways, ethnic cleansing and genocide can be this taken to a very aggressive and extreme degree.
Yes, very much so. The useful past, I think, is something that you're referring to. Anderson refers to it. It's kind of one of the steps in, nation building. And
well, there's an advantage to coming together for any kind of group of people, not just nation states. There's an advantage to coming together around a common narrative. that common
Yeah.
narrative that validates why you were doing the thing you were doing. And this is escaping a little bit from history and talking, I guess, life advice. But you don't need to validate where you've been to decide where you're going.
100%. And that's my issue with narrative, like singular narrative building. It's a reason why, in Ukraine, a lot of people are calling for, there needs to be this narrative because Ukraine has a very divided history. It's a big country that is, has, very multifaceted, very, diverse history. And it's hard to make a singular narrative. But to me, the people are focusing on, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists who, that's a whole different topic. And, the exploits of Ukrainian independence fighters without focusing on the crimes that they committed, without focusing on the lack of inclusiveness in regards to national minorities in Ukraine, which,
Right. Of
the
which there
Poles,
are
Jews,
Poles, Jewish, Russians.
Russian, yeah,
Uh, well, I think that gets. I think you start to come into a fact like you have to make space for people, and a singular narrative doesn't allow for that. Um,
no, it doesn't.
More to the point, we are at a particular position for especially a lot of South American and African and Eastern European and Balkans, etc. countries where they were not and Middle East too, and to a lesser extent Southeast Asia. You are in a position where a lot of these countries were not formed uh, by themselves. They were
Mhm.
formed by colonial powers, or they were had these things imposed upon them by empires. And now there are you have people sitting in nations that by any right don't exist by the same mode of the colonial, like, there's not the same concept in the United Kingdom of being part of the United Kingdom as there would be for a Ukrainian in Ukraine.
Of course,
And I think we have to talk about more broadly as people, um, that we have to make the best of where we're at.
of course.
And
With that said, should we call it a day? And thank you all for tuning in. This has been actually, out of all of the three, probably my favorite one, probably the most intellectually stimulating of the discussions on genocide. I believe that we should maybe explore, and I'd like people who are watching this, maybe, hopefully some people are watching,
there are.
um, now than later. I'd like you to maybe pick a topic within this large topic of something we can focus on. We might not devote, like, a specific episode to it, where we're coming up with their own thing. We could even review someone else's flawed opinion on a certain, on any one of these topics. I've also thought about inviting several scholar friends of mine, who are specialists in some of these topics, notably Holocaust and Holodomor studies. So yeah, write in the comments section what you'd like to see, and
Also,
we will do our best.
we have a Discord. It's in the doobly doo down below. I have a stream content suggestion. We are going to start taking a look at together, not just me, so you get twice the sarcasm. Uh, we're going to start taking a look at some other historical YouTubers and giving some critiques there, which we should be arranging to do sometime this week.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to bring up is I know I've been promising to finish this essay now for a month and a half, but we are moving to the part two of the political violence in America. I spent all day sitting in my reading chair with my dog on my lap working on it, and I have 500 words of script written, so that's a start. Um, Other than that, I want to thank everybody for showing
It's
up.
hey, it's two. What is that? Two, three paragraphs, four paragraphs. It's more
It's
than a good start.
2.5 paragraphs. Thank you very much. Um,
All right.